August 934, Dunnottar. There was to be a Cayley that night, as if Constantine had been preparing for it after all, and not expecting a battle. The hall was now being decorated with new torches, swept of its old straw, and more tables were being brought in. At the center, Constantine's throne. And it was to be a good night, if we were to stop at the Cayley, if discussions to the details of the peace treaty were not gone into, which was why what happened had happened, Utad assumed, and why there had been uproar, why there had been chaos, why his best friend had left, in pursuit of number. Let the story be told in its proper order. Let it begin with Utad's own thoughts when he first got to Dunnottar, and seen the mighty fortress, itself defended by rock and cliff, long ago housing, defending the kings of Alba and, back before Constantine's father, the king of the Picts, whence the line of Alpin had come. Before a Pictish princess had married a Gaelish prince, and said Gaelish prince had murdered all contenders for the throne at a feast not unlike the one that was about to be enjoyed that night. Already, anticipation was growing as Constantine was, it seemed, determined to offer the best of Gaelish hospitality. All cellars and storehouses must have been emptied that afternoon to provide for not only Alba, but Strathclyde, Mercia, Wessex and High Wills Cymru. A vast host had descended and forced Constantine's hand. Yet, Constantine must have planned for it, because there must have been twice the usual victuals that were needed by one household. Almost as if he had been expecting the company of the king from the south and many hundreds of warriors. So, she had lived here, his sister, thought Utad, looking at the inside of the fortress. It was well guarded, by the river and the sea to its back. But Aethelestan had proved that a well-guarded fortress could also be a prison, a corner in which to be backed into. He had spread himself too thin, had the king of Alba, in Utad's opinion. That, and being unprepared for just how many allies that Aethelestan would bring to his doorstep. He had spoken to Finan about this, once, about Osrith and her life after she had fled Bibbenberg. Small words just after Osrith and Finan had married, and Finan had first returned to Bibbenberg alone. His friend had said Osrith would have been at Dunnottar first, when Ivar had made an ill-fated attempt on the fortress. Just after the Battle of Ethandun, where you fought Guthrum. You make it sound like I did this alone, Utad told Finan. They had been looking north, at the ships that always were on the horizon, waiting for Aethelestan, who was to come into Dunnottar fortress for the feast, to enjoy Constantine's hospitality. Finan had been teaching Utad how to recognize Alba ships as they appeared beyond Lindisfarne. Utad could not make out what Finan was saying at such a distance. Finan's I-8 had always been excellent. Did ye not, now? Finan asked with a grin, and went on, at Utad's continued conversation, to explain that Inirian, the slave ship which had taken Ethan, had also taken him. So, Osrith would have been at Caligwilid when Guthard had sent him to be a slave, and Gisela to a nunnery to await her fate with Elfric, and had come south to Winchester just as Alfred had given him land for he and Gisela to live in peace. They had long discussed it, he and Finan. He knew a terrible thing had happened to Osrith at Caligwilid, when he had been the last. He had tracked down the monk by the name of Findle, who he had found had once known Osrith. While he was happy to tell Utad of their friendship, he said little about her time in the city. She was mistreated, was all that he would tell him, even at knife point, but Utad had pressed with the rumor that his sister had married Guthard, Utad's brother-in-law. On paper, Findle had told Utad, still unflinching under blade. The monks wrote it down at the behest of Abbot Ealdred. That bastard, Utad had spat. The same bastard who had tricked Osrith into slavery. So, on paper, she is the ruler of Caligwilid. On paper, Findle had agreed. But she has not been here to claim it. And, as ward to Constantine, I am her brother. Utad had snapped. She may have grown in Alba, but my right as an ealdorman means I get a say over my sister. Except, Findle told him, astutely, she married Sainidiu I Alpin, and now she has married your warrior. Findle glanced back at Finan, who I know to be prince, and claim king to Alaid, in the north of Irian, who was married to your sister by the authority of King Constantine of Alba, not Northumbria, not Caligulid, not Aethelstan's England. Only a court could preside over such things, and under whose rule would this court sit? Mine, of course. Except Constantine would say different. Alba follows Gaelish law, ancient Pictish law, which he refined shortly after his reign began, to bind the kingdoms together under the church. All Alba are bound in heart, bound in head to the land, and the law made by the king. He has a claim to Osrith in the law of Alba, because she wed an Alba nobleman. At this point, Uhtred had looked at Finan, who shrugged. The law was different in Alba, but not so different that a man did not have rights over his widowed sister. Or were they? And it had been he who had made Osrith a widow by running Seinedui Alpin through. So, what do you believe, Uhtred of Bibbenberg? And in truth, Uhtred did not know what to believe. If he claimed he supported one iteration of his sister's story, there would be other kings who would support the other. If he accepted that Osrith had been under the authority of their uncle Elfric, then he must accept she had claimed refuge under Dui Alpin, and as such, belonging to no one, and as such, ward of the king, whichever king was the king of Alba. In short, Osrith had been his shadow, there, just on the very edge of his sight for all of his life, and who was again making life difficult for him. Yet, this king had granted Finan permission to marry Osrith there, at Dunnottar, which was a good thing, for they clearly loved one another. But that was not the point. Clearly, this code or system was in place that reflected what Bergendigel had heard, what Bishop Findel had told him. Now, in Dunnottar, the fortress that Aethelstan had sought to dominate to gain Constantine's acquiescence, but which Constantine had defended until he had gained the advantage, Uhtred and Finan stood, looking about them, anticipating the feasting and drinking that was to come, watching people come and go. Uhtred did not like the idea of telling Finan what he was about to tell him. You were here, Finan, Uhtred told his friend, as servants moved past them, carrying tables, carrying trays and platters and banners, from rooms on different levels into the halls. Which way is the hall? Or, do you only know the bedroom? The hall is this way, Finan told him, diplomatically. And then chapel, where Osrith and I married, is just beyond. As to anything else, Finan trailed off and refused to talk about. After. And you married under the Irish church, Uhtred said to him. I did, Finan replied. For Constantine, for the monks at Culde's, follow Comsil's doctrine. As did your ancestors, at one time. Your ancestor Oswald, for example. Uhtred nodded as two servant girls carrying baskets hurried past them. One turned, her black hair catching the evening light, and smiled at Uhtred before turning back to the hall. And what would Benedetta say? Finan asked him. I am not married to Benedetta, Uhtred replied. I am not married to anyone. And Benedetta would say her grandmother told her never to marry. But you are, Uhtred emphasized, and you say you know the Irish church. I say, I was married under the Irish church, Finan replied. And I married here because I knew it would make her happy. But I would be married, not married, married by the Syhina Woodland Grove to be with Osrith if that's what it took. He broke off, his voice having lowered to a whisper. What is it, Lord? Finan asked, emphasizing the Lord. Did I not see you and your sister come to an end to your enmity? Not me, Uhtred told him. But, there may be a problem. You definitely married under the Irish church? I did, Finan told him. In front of all here will tell you so. And this was 10 years ago? Longer, Finan told him. It was shortly after you gained Bibbenberg, 16 years, he told him, with a quick computation. He saw Uhtred exhale slowly. You know the one thing which we discussed that Osrith was not going to like? The arrangement Constantine has had with Aethelstan over hostages. He moved out of the way as two warriors carried through some benches. A promising smell of smoke coming in the direction of the kitchens diffused towards them. I do, Finan replied, warily. Well, you may need to add another to the list, Uhtred told him. But I need to be sure before I cause a problem. You, concerned you have caused a problem? Did I hear right? Am I speaking to the Lord of Bibbenberg? Uhtred said nothing, but drew Finan nearer to the wall. I may have done something which has caused Constantine to have something he can use against Aethelstan in relation to Bernicia, Beric in particular. Finan shook his head. Why don't I like the sound of where this is going? He asked his friend. May have? Finan repeated. What do you know of something called Brehon law? Utad asked him. Finan said nothing for a moment. As his mind drifted back to the priests he remembered from his father's fortress. They hated the ancient law, the one that the original inhabitants of Irian used before St. Patrick united Ireland with the Church. Too many pagan practices, and yet, too many still followed it: hand weddings, sharing of property, assault and murder. Although this was like the word guild system that St. Patrick tied together laws, the Cruth, freeholding laws of the ancient Irish, to the Church, he said to his friend that it is to do with honor, and property and women's rights, such as Osrith's right to her mother's land, that she gave to Edra. He saw the look on Utad's face. What? Finan asked, and when Utad did not reply, demanded, what? Patrick was of Caligulid, was he not? Utad was staring at Finan now. I do believe so. Kidnapped from Rust and brought by the Irish as a slave, he then returned back of his own volition, took the church teachings with him, and converted the country. What, Utad? Finan asked. What are you telling me? That you learned in history, like. He broke off and swallowed the words, like your son, before they muddied the disjointed story that Utad was trying to tell him. It's what I don't know myself that I am concerned about. I don't know what I don't know, Finan. What he heard was that a marriage annulled, to be annulled, over, ended, on the basis of the Brehon law. He has another man ready. Who? What? Ready for what? Utad, you're not making a lot of sense, now. Who told you? After the meeting with Aethelstan, in the grounds, before Constantine invited Aethelstan and the Englaland army to tea, he arrayed his hand in the direction of the frantic preparations in the hall. There was a conversation between Constantine and some of his allies. Anlaf was there, Domnall too, and Guthfrith. Berg could not understand it all. All the Gaelish that Berg knows is, go and fuck yourself, Norseman, on account of him having had it shouted at him so many times when he was in Irian. Finan told Utad, with a laugh. It was not a laugh that conveyed humor, and he leaned towards his lord uneasily, as if preparing himself for bad news. He spoke to Anlaf, who can speak Gaelish well. Anlaf did not understand the idea, though he knew the Gaelish words. It is something to do with Osrith, and that she had been shamed. Shamed. Finan repeated the word as if trying to understand it, though he knew it well enough. He didn't, however, know much about the ancient laws surrounding it, except that there were many forms of accepted marriage, but only one that linked to church law, the one between two willing people, a man and a woman. And shaming meant destitution for the woman unless there was the shaming that shit of an Englaland captain did to her. The blue dye. Finan nodded. They had not spoken about it since it had happened, and it was only because Utad had exacted justice that afternoon and killed Ealdred that it was in his mind. I know nothing more, Utad said, trying to sound dismissive. I am probably wrong. Perhaps speak to Osrith dash. He glanced around. The wide passageway on the way to the hall was filling up. More chairs were being brought, and with them, Constantine's blue unicorn banners. Perhaps we should just enjoy the party and I will take my wife back to her land, Lord, Finan told him, unless you have anything specific I should say to her. But there was more to the conversation. One Constantine had with another man, another Gael. Do you not want to know whether Osrith knows something of it? Finan looked away for a moment, and then turned back to his friend. I do not want to speak of my marriage, he told Utad, finally. She is struggling with her sight after that man. Finan broke off. You killed him to put right the shame, in front of everyone, and I did not. We have been beside one another for years, and I have never once questioned you about your women. Finan, I will not hear anything you say. Utad, you have said not a crossword between the two of ye for 6 hours now, and I would like it to stay like that. But, my killing him, it was for your sake. You are my warrior. Thanduine ace thabinagam. Finan insisted, folding his arms. It is no more, no less than the fact that Thadu Ines, Thabinagam, you are her husband, she is your wife. Finan turned his head, for it had not been Utad who had translated his Gaelish words. A red-headed woman stood before them, and looked between Finan and Utad. Finan bowed his head to Edra. You are more beautiful than the last time I saw ye, he said to Osrith's adopted daughter. Which was how long ago? When you said those words to her, Edra said to Finan, when you married. Where is she? Along with young Finan, Utad told her, and watched as the Iru incarnate in her daughter smiled brightly to him, and then turned back to Finan. Speak to Methair about what? Her leaving? She wants to go as soon as she can. Tonight, she spoke of. Finan and Utad exchanged a glance. But neither could say anything, for Utad, fresh from the stables, crossed the flagstones to her brother. What? Asked Osrith, looking to her husband. It was true, she wasn't entirely well dressed for an evening of merrymaking. Just how much I love ye, I was thinking, Finan said to her, in English. But immediately as he took her in his arms and kissed Osrith with a kiss that she would never forget, then Edra was ready to speak to her. Osrith stepped back, thinking how different it felt, knowing her brother was there, supporting her now, not trying to attack her at every turn. Methair, Domhnall tells me you are leaving. She shook her head at Osrith's appearance and looked her up and down as their roles reversed. Have you been in the stables? We have servants for that. Stable hands, and so on. Edru put a hand on each of Osrith's shoulders. Utad gave Finan a swift glance. I will be, Osrith told her. I will stay while I hear young Finan. He is away with Egil practicing for this evening's entertainment, with Malcolm and Maldub and Laceren, the horses young Utad's, she added, nodding to Utad. He came with a rearguard of mercenaries. I'll kill him. Utad spat. I told him to remain at Bibbenberg, with Benedetta. She is here too, Osrith told him, and stopped, the laugh coming from her mouth when she saw Utad's expression. Then who is holding Bibbenberg? Utad demanded. That is all I know, Osrith replied, and, not wanting to get into a second-hand argument. And I heard you kept the children entertained and everyone's spirits up, storytelling and the like. This she asked to Edra. Thank you, Methair, Edra said to Osrith, but I am nothing compared to Ildu, to young Finan. And swiftly, as if to cover that she nearly said the name of Constantine's firstborn, added, did you know Caer Elaine is here too? She came with King Gibleton and Anlaf. They stopped the attack, so I understand. Which attack? Osrith asked. That of the enemy, of course, Edra replied. There is no enemy, Utad declared. I would say my enemy today was the one attacking the warriors who defend my home. Edra retorted. Did you attack my home? The silence from her brother was heavy and Osrith had to force herself not to say anything and definitely not to laugh. I did not, Utad told her. I merely returned your brother to you. Edra smiled. I am glad to hear it. Of course you know Finan, Osrith said to Edra. And this is Utad, Lord of Bibbenberg. My brother. Utad smiled in acknowledgement and gave a little bow of his head to Edra. I have heard a lot about you, he told her. You look just like your mother. He watched as Edra gave a look to Osrith, one weighted with the knowledge of what she had told her of her brother over the years, and then back to Utad. Your Danish mother, my sister, Thyra, Utad was keen to clarify. And I knew your father well. Bika. Bika, Edru echoed. He was a very holy man, she added, as if a phrase she had learned long ago. I met him once. Here she flicked her eyes to Osrith. Or so Methair tells me. I travelled with her to Winchester. I do not remember. I congratulate you on your wedding, Utad went on. You are the queen of the lands to the west of Northumbria. He meant the lands that Edra had described to Osrith and that Osrith had given to Edra as a wedding gift. And these are your children? He asked, spying a girl and a boy behind her. Edra turned and beckoned them to her. Orphans, she told Utad. I am told their parents were Danish, Norse. So I tell them of their heritage, their origins, the stories of their kin. Elasade raises them, she added. The maid, the fortress keeper, Edra told Utad. Do you have not a fortress keeper for Bibbenberg? Her words were a little condescending, a little pitying. I am sorry if you do not. Then she turned back to Osrith. Come with me, Mater, I will not have you attending this party in your fine clothes. Finan and Uhtred both turned and grinned to one another as Osrith was led away by her forthright daughter, turning and giving them both a shrug and a smile, as if she'd do anything to stop Edra. The children in tow as they heard Thyra's daughter fuss over her mother's hair, recommending what wash treatments might get out the woad dye, what clothes Elisade had for her. You did not ask her, Uhtred said, as he made to the outer door towards the stables. I did not, Finan told him, and changed the subject for Uhtred permanently by nodding through the balmy summer evening air in the direction of Benedetta. 88,888,888. What do you mean? I must wear a dress. You must wear a dress, Mater. Edra told Osrith, there is going to be music, and dancing. And, dancing? Osrith repeated, her heart falling. She would be better off trying to tiptoe over the fourth river than dance. The Gaelish dancing, Edra clarified. And you can hardly do that in your fighting clothes. She shook her head at Osrith's leather jerkin, her breeches and shirt. Gaelish dancing, Osrith thought, her mind falling to Dund, and the celebrations that comprised Domhnall's coronation. She had fucked Constantine that night, in the high-up stable, ridden herself down onto him, as he caught her breasts in his hand and hung onto her nipples, doing as he wanted, and what Constantine had wanted had been effective enough to give Osrith her first orgasm in company. And after, when young Finan goes south, he can teach it. The music, that is, Edra told her. South. With her. On with Finan back to Bibbenberg. That young Uhtred had come, and had immediately greeted her son, suggested the latter. She looked dolefully at the two options, the only two options, that she had done not, and she wanted neither. What Osrith wanted was to ride south as quickly as possible to speak to Caltigar, to Mund. News had come from Eswi, who had ridden up and arrived just after young Uhtred and Benedetta that Beric men had raided south and, if it were true, was shocking to Osrith. Not just from the terror they would have inflicted on neighboring villages and thereby inviting those replying in kind, but that south was Northumbria, claimed by Aethelstan, which put Osrith directly against the king. No one will miss me, Edra, Osrith told her daughter, pushing away the garments in her daughter's hand. I must go to my land. No one? Edra repeated. I am no one. Osrith stopped, and turned to her daughter, listening as she added, what is one night? You cannot so easily ride in the dark, especially with your eyes. Stay, please. For me? For young Finan? For Constantine? Osrith relented. What was one evening when in the morning she could go, refreshed, and figure out what was going on in Berwick? Beating the Englaland army back would also be a plus, and she would be back if Aethelstan chose the Great North Road to return back to Ofoik, or Mercia, or Winchester. Is the king of the islands really here? Osrith asked Edra, as she handed Osrith the first dress. It was the one which Elisade had made for her to marry Sainid. Osrith looked over its beautiful linen fibers. Sainid brought it back to Elisade the morning after you had married, Edra told her. Although you once found it on the stable floor. It didn't absorb too much horse shit, Osrith retorted, wryly. Mother, Edra exclaimed. And no, it is as beautiful as when you married him. She glanced out of the tower window. Although, had he not been killed, you could not have married Finan. I do not wish to talk about it, Osrith told her daughter. I loved Sainid, and he died fighting against Uhtred, for Alba, and Ethelelm. She shook her head. And I never went back to find him, to bring his body back. It was a battlefield. You, no, Osrith told her daughter. I did not go back. She repeated. What sort of a wife was I? One who would heed him, for Sainid, I am sure, would not have wanted you to go back. He would have gone out to sea with the tide. A breeze, noticeable by its presence in the backdrop of the still, sultry August evening, whistled past the window. Burn it, Osrith told her. Throw it into the fire, or give it to someone who may want it. I can never see it again. Her vehemence was enough to stop Edra from arguing. Let it be so. She called from the window to the Morrigan who had, no doubt, sent the wind. She leaned out of the window. Let him be at peace, and tell him I am sorry. I will care for his land to my last breath." When Osrith finally turned to her daughter, her distress was replaced with a smile. She looked upon Edra and at the other dress in her hand. Rich and opulent, it had an overlay of silk, and must have cost a lot of money. It reminded Osrith of the wedding dress that Malmuir had worn when she had married Flancina at Dara. "It was traded up from some faraway place and Athair bought it for me," Edra told her. No matter what Elasade did, she could not get the fitting. "It is more your shape than mine," she added, nodding to the straightness of the bodice, the flat hips, the length of the skirt. "Then I will wear it, for it will make a fine dancing dress," Osrith told Edra. "For you," she added. "And mind you leave Buet and tagged Sikhs here," Edra told her. "Where are they?" "In the armory," Osrith told her. And that was all she was about to tell her daughter, rather than the real reason she was mucky after being in the stables and chanced upon young Uhtred and Benedetta riding together in front of the fortress. Her horse was saddled and her weapons stowed, and the horse had been disguised at the back of the stables, with hopefully little chance of being noticed in the celebrations that night. For Osrith was going just as soon as she was able, to be first back to Berwick, to reinforce her land, and make sure both kings knew that Sainid's land was neither Constantine's nor Ethelstan's, neither Alba nor Englaland. "Though I am sure if I could wear what I am comfortable in, I would be happier. Angus will have something for me." Edra began to narrow her eyes, ready to insist, but a knock came to the door. Before either Osrith or Edra could call out to ask who it was, Domhnall's voice came through the door. "Are ye ready, Osrit?" "Only, Constantine is to come up." "Thought I should give ye fair warning." "Come in, Domhnall," Edra called back, slightly exasperation in her tone. "And tell Mater she is not to go to the feast in her breeches and jerkin." "Tell her," she broke off as the door opened. Domhnall strode in and nodded to Edra. "This one," Edra insisted, holding on to Osrith's wedding dress from her marriage to Sainid. Domhnall nodded to it. "It is the one Constantine wishes you to wear." "I will not," Osrith told him, and even when Domhnall had taken her by the hand and led her over to Edra. "Will you wear it?" Domhnall asked her again. "How can I wear it? I wed a Sainid in it," she told him. "Do you not have the dress in which you married the Alade bastard?" Domhnall grinned. Osrith shook her head. "It went for clothes, to the poor," she told him. "There was a trade shortage." "There's this," Edra told him, and held up the blue one. Osrith, who had only just acquiesced for her daughter's sake, folded her arms in defiance. "Speak to her, Domhnall," Edra exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "She needs to be dressed in a dress." Edra emphasized the word, dress, for when Athair comes to lead her to the feast. She thrust the blue dress into his hands, and gave Osrith an exasperated look. "I will see where Elasade is with the hot water." She strode out of the tower room and through the door behind her. "I am going to Berwick," Osrith told him, her arms still folded. "And I'm not disputing that," Domhnall replied, "except that Constantine has called the Cayley, and wishes you to step in with him." He looked at the dress. "And this isn't so bad." "You wear it then," Osrith told him, hotly, "and I'll wear your clothes. You seem to have put on your best." "They are," Domhnall nodded, and pushed the dress to Osrith. "One evening. You have to admit the King of Alba has outsmarted the upstart from the south." "He has," Osrith told Domhnall, "and it is usually me defending him, not you." She glanced to the window. It might be a bit of a challenge, but Osrith reckoned she could get to the stable roof from the tower room. "And you can be beside your husband," he added. "He is a Gale, who is, from his very vows, bound to Constantine." When Osrith would be standing at the top of the tower back in Berwick, watching Alba and Englaland soldiers pass up and down the Great North Road, notably giving her lands a wide berth, she would wonder her words to Domhnall then, and how it was Constantine's interpretation of everything was so much at odds with what she had believed. At what point had Constantine begun to take Finan's actions against the law? At what point had Osrith's words been used against her? Finan? Osrith then said to Domhnall, "He will do as he always does. He will go with Uhtred." A strange look passed over Domhnall's face for a moment, and then he nodded. "The blue dress, then, if not Sainid's dress," he commented. "The blue dress," Then, Osrith repeated, throwing her hands to her jerkin and pulling it off, pulling at her boots and throwing them onto the floor. "All right, if you insist," she added, and pulled off her overshirt. "Osrit," Domhnall protested as Osrith got down to her breeches and shirt, but he did not look away as she stood naked before him. "Then leave," Osrith told him, harshly. "It's not as if you've never seen me naked before." Half of Inglaland, and Beric, and Alba did. She grabbed for the dress from Domhnall's unresisting fingers, noticing that he did not look away from her body. But then, he was her friend, he had seen her naked before, and there was no attraction from either of them, which is why Osrith had done it, she supposed. "I'll wear the blue dress," she went on, the sudden anger in her chest dissipating as quickly as it had arisen. "It'll go with my blue body." And she watched him watch her pull her breeches and undershirt back on. "Can you help me, then?" she added, pulling at the lacings on the back of it before shaking the dress open and stepping into it. "Come on, get this thing on me, and I can play my part." There was a short pause, and Osrith thought that Domhnall wasn't going to do anything. She looked over her shoulder, about to ask him again, prepared to be nicer this time, but realized he was standing just behind her. Domhnall pulled the dress up her body and helped her to put her arms into the sleeves, his hands smoothing down her sides. Osrith turned, from the neck down, a neat and presentable Gaelish warrior, albeit masquerading in a dress, her hair wild about her,